Welcome to the Wellbeing Dialogues. Welcome to the Wellbeing Dialogues, the podcast for minds that wonder, wobble, and wonder, where we explore the people, practices, and insights transforming how we understand emotional well-being, especially in children. I am your host, Jacqueline Klemke. I am a systemic couples and family coach, mental health first aid trainer, and mental health and well-being consultant. I am also the co-founder of a Frankfurt-based organization called Let's Be Real Mental Health for Young Minds. Today, I am honored to speak with Sophie Moss, an education strategist, behavioral and curriculum specialist, and founder of Bridge and Bloom, a consultancy focused on transforming school culture through emotional intelligence, curriculum design, and AI strategy. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank
Glad
you
you could
Jacqueline.
join the podcast.
I'm glad to be here.
Now, Sophie, the first topic we want to talk about is emotional intelligence and leadership. That's one of the areas that you focus on in your consultancy work. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to focus on emotionally intelligent leadership in schools?
Thank you. That's a lovely question. Well, what I noticed was that I kept seeing strong, committed, and caring educators getting blamed for issues that were actually system failures. For example, behavior issues, burnout, disengagement, and they weren't actually about values or effort. They were actually about capacity. So for me, emotionally intelligent leadership really is about understanding how pressure flows through a system and ensuring that it doesn't land on those most or least powerful. That's what drew me into emotionally intelligent leadership.
And could you give us an example of how you can make sure that it doesn't get passed on to the least powerful? What is one of the things that you can do in order to make that happen, to become emotionally intelligent as a leader?
And that's exactly where I decided to create Behavior Navigators, which is one of my roles. And that role is grounded in explaining how communication is being transmitted or translated through the system, but actually how it's being communicated in the system, not in people, but as a systemic issue. So in order for people to understand how to execute emotional intelligence, they need to actually understand how to co-regulate. And that's one of the things we focus on. And as educators and my experience in schools, I noticed that as much as majority of us that are in schools are there because we want to help. We want to help children. However, the one thing that we don't tend to skill our educators in is emotional literacy. We expect a particular outcome, but we don't tend to actually train them with that. So that is one of the areas that needs to be looked at or delved into, and actually organizations need to focus on building that.
So what do behavioral navigators do?
So behavior navigators, they are actually the adults in the system, and they're the ones that are helping the children or the young learners to navigate their emotions when they encounter a challenge. So it could be an academic challenge, it could be a social challenge, and through coaching techniques and questioning techniques, they are showing that child how to actually navigate, how to siphon, assess, evaluate, how to develop accountability. So in the end, the child is gaining resilience. And I believe that that is one of the fundamental skills for the future that children need, is how to problem solve. So the behavior navigator is there as a support mechanism for the child in order for them, the child, to be able to achieve their potential. Yeah.
Sounds very interesting. And how do they work? Are they new positions? Are they existing positions that are upskilled to become behavioral navigators? And how many of that would you need in a school in order for that to work effectively?
So what I actually noticed was the fact that depending on the size of the organization and the focus of the organization and where they stand and where they're positioned will depend on how many of these type of roles they require. Also, because in the UK, we're also seeing a very high percentage of staff leaving, teachers leaving. So there's that as well. And the talent pool is also a question for us. We don't have a very rich talent pool at the moment. So there's a lot of our operational considerations. So what's the one thing that I do is I help the organization focus on whether their current complement of educators that are there require upskilling or just realigning, or whether they require to recruit a particular person specification, which is more empathetic and which is more directed towards these kind of traits. Because sometimes you find that teachers feel that they have reached it, that is where they're at and they're very comfortable with where they are. So therefore, that's fine. But obviously, we know that what is required is we need to get to a certain depth of empathy, and we need to get a certain depth of understanding that we are here to afford the child, the information and the emotional skills in order to be able to make their judgment. So we are not instructional anymore. We are actually facilitators, and that's the other role that I also do, which is pedagogical facilitators, because they need to function in tandem. And that's why I say it's systemic. So it's not just one thing. You can't take the behavior navigators and put them into the system. That won't sort it. You need the behavior navigators, then you need the educators to be facilitators, to understand that they're transitioning from instructional to facilitating learning. And then once that is understood, then you start to have a foundation that you can work with. And that's actually a deep conversation that I have at an organizational level, just to understand because if it's a quick fix, then I'm not the person, because you can't do it. You can't do a quick fix. It has to be systemic, and it has to be over a long period of time. And then it has to be evaluated, viewed. It has to be an iterative process. So there's a lot involved, because we're talking about emotions. We're talking about emotional behavior, and it's not one size fits all, but it is one strategy, and consistently implemented can achieve the desired results that we as parents want, we as educators want, and definitely our children need.
Oh, absolutely. Reminds me of a lot of the work that we also do at Let's Be Real, the systemic approach that we need in making this happen, right? And in particular, the quick fixes that sometimes are expected, even though they're not very sustainable.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about assessments. Assessments are part of school reality. Assessments come with all kinds of emotions, coming back to the emotional element. And in a lot of children, they come with anxiousness or fear or concerns. And in order to introduce that, I'm going to share just a small story that happened to one of my daughters when she was in second grade. The class teacher basically introduced the assessment as saying, and if you don't do this and this and that in the assessment, you're going to get an E. So you're going to get the worst grade possible. It took my daughter a while to bring that home because she was still processing the sentence, but it popped up in all kinds of other households. I heard this from a variety of parents. It caused a lot of distress in a lot of kids, from, the psychosomatic symptoms like tummy aches to throwing up to not wanting to go to school to being scared of every single assessment that followed after. And so my question is, you talk about assessments shaping emotional climate. Now, ideally, we want really to assess what they know and not how well they can perform given the circumstances. So what do you do in order to make sure that assessments can actually really take stock of where the child is at?
Yeah, I love this point, because as being a teacher for so many years, it's very easy to get caught up in the fact that assessment measures performance. And as long as a teacher, you tend to think, as long as me as a teacher, I have a bond with my students and my students are okay, that means when they're getting assessed, they are performing. They're fine, they're performing. So therefore, the assessment is an accurate data measure. However, my opinion is that it not only measures the learner's output at that moment, it also measures the emotional state of the child at that level. So therefore, we have to ask ourselves, are we then getting an accurate assessment of their performance at that time? There are a school of people, a thought that will say, then how do we measure? What are we supposed to measure? The emotional and then the academic and put it together? The point is not to separate assessments. It is when we consider that they are in a high stakes and time measured climate that they will automatically, being children, they will automatically be put in a condition of threat. And then we all know, us that know about trauma and psychology, we know that the minute we see a threat, we're in fight or flight. So our nervous system, that's it. We stop functioning academically because our emotions have taken over. So we will never be able to show that we are at our optimum academic level. And that, for me, all the data from that moment, I feel is inaccurate because we haven't taken that one critical point into account. So we need to actually ensure that we have educators, teachers that are in place that are co-regulators and are facilitators and are consistent with the approaches, the tactics, the strategies, because children need that consistency and they need that routine in order to have that safe environment. The minute over a period of time we have created that climate, right? And that goes throughout. So it's throughout the years as well as organizationally, the hierarchical organization. I know we like to think we're not, but we are somehow hierarchical. So it needs to be throughout. And then when that climate is consistent for that child, it will automatically feel that it's in a safe environment. The minute it's in a safe environment, be it that needs to go into this now setting and it needs to show their lovely learning. All right, then it'll be perceived completely differently. It won't be perceived that I have to do it perfectly. The child will understand that I am just doing my best at that moment in time. It does not define me. It is okay. And in truth, it doesn't define them. It is just a measure of that time, of that moment in time. And as long as we have a climate of emotional intelligence, we are telling ourselves, as well as our children or the learners that we are entrusted with, that we are learning. So we will make mistakes. We will have areas of improvement, but that's okay. Because look, I have this strategy for you. I have this tactic. I myself as the adult, I had this situation, I tried this. So the minute we have that climate, we can then, I think, say that we have come closer to actually assessing the true potential of that child. So I'd like to end with the fact that assessment always teaches something, even when we don't mean it to. So it's like an invisible gift, and that invisible gift is dependent on a child being empowered. And you can't empower that child if that child or that learner feels that they're not in a safe environment. Then we've lost the battle. So what are we exactly doing?
So in order for that to happen, you would also have to build this over time. You would have to build the language. You would have to build the routines, basically, so that in that situation, it's just another one of those, I just go show off what I've learned. Instead of, oh my God, I have to get an A. And if I don't, then somehow I am worthless.
Exactly.
It requires a lot of the teachers, too, in that case, right? Because they need to go out of their way and not just say it once ahead of the assessment, but it needs to become part of the daily, language almost, right? Because otherwise, if it's just a one-off thing during the assessment, the child will go, yeah, you're just saying that, but it's not really true.
And that's another thing. You're absolutely right, because that's another area that I found being a teacher as well, because I've done it everything from like a one-to-one to a teaching assistant all the way up. So seeing all the different aspects of a teaching environment, I can very confidently say that teachers, as much as some of us are parents, we bring that understanding. However, it seemed to be that the culture at that time, or the culture we are in right now in education systems, does not allow that space for that teacher to actually learn whether the strategy that they're using, possibly at home, is the correct strategy to use with different children, with different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural. As a teacher, we're asked to do quite a lot. We're asked to not only reach the needs, the academic needs, we need to reach the academic needs once we create a bond, a relationship, once we earn the trust of the child. So there's a lot even before. And I know, as an example, whenever I used to come into a class, I used to take on a new class, I knew that the first 3 to 4 weeks was building trust. You have to build that trust. You have to get that routine. You have to find those connection points with each individual student so that you knew that when the child would experience a perceived challenge, then you'd have added information to help that child through, because the child would allow you to do it because they trust you. But then at the same time, you can only achieve that through consistency, through honesty, being honest with the child, being consistent, being fair, never moving towards sanctions that seem unfair or humiliating. Like that example you gave, if the child is being told you will get this, automatically it's put in an expectation on a ladder of expectation that it doesn't need to be on there, because it's possibly thinking, oh geez, I actually thought that I could do it, but now if you're telling me I need to, you in a way aren't trusting me. So automatically there's self-doubt even before the child is had that done it. So I'd say yes, absolutely. We need to make sure that the teachers are trained, and I haven't seen organizations that have focused on training the teachers in emotional literacy. What I have seen is organizations using restorative approaches to behavior, putting it into behavior policy, giving particular scripts, a 30-second script or whatever, and asking the adults to memorize that. And that would be the way to communicate it. Yes. Yeah.
Really, like a one-size-fits-all model for
Yeah, like
every
the 30
student.
absolutely 30-second script laminated on a lanyard. So if you encounter something, you have it there. So you're saying the same words. And I think I could see the point in trying to do something and make it consistent so that everybody had the same language. But I think what we lost with that was that we weren't transmitting authenticity. We weren't transmitting that we cared. So for a child, it's just this repetition coming at them, and it didn't have the impact. So now, with the way I'm doing my business and the way I'm thinking, is the fact of the teachers need to now answer a very personal question. Am I willing to learn a different way of communicating? As much as I might be 10 years plus in teaching, or 1 year, or doesn't matter what, but am I ready to now see myself in this age of AI and everything, see myself as my position here is at the back of the student, or beside the student, not in front anymore. I'm at the back of and I am then, through my co-regulation and through me understanding myself first, because I need to understand my nervous system. I need to understand what my triggers are. So therefore, the minute I understand my triggers, and this is serious, deep thinking and assessing triggers, it's because I've done it. So it asks a lot of honesty in yourself. So you need to be very sure that that is what you want to do with a child, because I believe that to be in a child's life is a privilege. And teaching is a very privileged profession. And in order to be in it, you have to understand that you're there for somebody else, not for yourself in any way. And I think that just needs to be clarified, and there needs to be a slight pivot that shows this is now the expectation, because the child doesn't need you so much for information, because we have AI, right? They need you for how. How do I discern what I need to do? How do I make those decisions that I'm finding challenging on an emotional level? What is my right or wrong? What is my considerations? And that's where also it comes into the adult being able to communicate with the parent, because there's a line, so it's not only in the school, and an organization can't think I'll build it first in my school and then I'll leave the second community till later. It's actually, I build it to a certain point, bring in the parents, bring in the other stakeholders, have that communication. Then, there'll be steps that the parents can do. Then you go to the next level, and it's more collaborative. It's quite large in a systemic change, only because the way we built our system, we've built it very like islands. We built it like that. We're separating. Now we are just joining it. That's all that needs to happen, is to join that. And we can only join it if we understand our emotional state. Therefore, we will understand another person's emotional state. And then I feel we will be able to be there for the children. Then we can say, no, I'm here because of the child, because I understand my nervous system. I'm fine. I've dealt with it. So when this is happening here, I know how to deal with it. And then that child is just thriving. And then the parents are also thriving because their child is thriving. Then we've won. That's what I want to do.
I fully agree with you, in particular on the element of involving parents, which is not something that schools naturally would do. For them, it's like two different universes, and they're like worlds apart, even though they're not. If we are able to translate what happens inside the school, into the homes and vice versa, then any effort we take in any of these spheres will just be a lot more, potent. The effect, the impact will be a lot more succinct. So yes, I fully applaud you for doing that. But I also know that it can be challenging because not something that schools are used to doing, isn't
Yes.
it? So when you tell them about involving the parent bit, what is the response you get? And how do you overcome the obstacle?
I think it's the way and when I say the organization, I mean the decision makers. When I'm talking about an
Sure.
organization, because
Sure.
obviously an organization isn't living and breathing, the decision makers. But it's how those decision makers perceive where the school is going to be positioned in the community. So once there is that understanding, all organizations want that communication with the parents. They want it with the wider community. I think what's happening is organizations are struggling to understand the connection with that community, because not only are there cultural differences, but they're cultural differences that are evolving very fast because of movement and migration and a lot of things happening. There's that element of keeping abreast with it. And the only way we can keep abreast with it is if we have a running communication with the parents and an open communication. So where parents don't see the school as having a shield, they have to see that it is completely open and they can at any time communicate. So I feel assessing one's barriers. What are the barriers that you think are there, as well as what are the barriers that you're not aware necessarily that exist, but they do exist? And then looking at it from that perspective of what is the outcome that you want? And if the outcome is to have a two-way conversation in order to benefit the child, then you have to sit down with those parents and look at what their needs are. What is their expectations? What's holding them back? But still know that together we can get this. So how do we get it? We get it with making sure that we communicate with a language that everybody understands, because we all have different languages, but that everyone understands, and giving opportunities where parents can see what the school is doing. They can see the changes, or they can see what's being put in place, not just being told, but they can see it. And then they are in the school and they're not reliant on the child coming home and saying, because we all are mothers, or most of us, and we know what our children say as aunts as well. So the parents need to come into the school. And then it also helps with cultural differences. They start to know the culture that the child is growing up in. It needs to be that. It's more than what we used to be as an organization. And we need to understand that as much as when the internet started, it took away the borders, the physical borders of countries. Now with AI, it's taken away also the other borders, the cultural border lines, those ones that seem to be to some abstract, but they're not. So it's taking away all of that. So we need to look at it whenever we encounter a challenge. What is the system behind it? What is the system? And when we look at it as a system, and that's what I try to show, is this is a system. This is not one issue, a connection between two dots. This is not only a system on one level. Sometimes it might be a three-dimensional system. So we need to see what's the pillar that we can put in place, and then we bring all the points together. And that is the emotional literacy and the emotional connection with everybody that's involved in a child's life. And then we'll be able to say, okay, we have that emotional connection, so therefore we will definitely have the professional outcome.
Right. Every one of us who's ever had a teacher that just made us thrive will remember what that entailed. For me, it was, for instance, my first French teacher who walked into the room, started speaking French. I didn't understand a word. And yet the way she went about learning, the way she made it fun, the way she connected to us as students just made me want to study. And those are the experiences we want children to have, because that's what they will carry forward into their adult lives as well, right?
Okay, can I just add something to that?
Sure.
Because you're absolutely right with that. However, I feel that sometimes we get carried away. We tend to get carried away with, we need teachers to make it fun and engaging, which is definitely part of it. But we don't tend to then supplement that with the added requirements. So what we end up getting is where maybe in pockets in an organization, you have a teacher that is making it very, fun and engaging, but yet there is still a lack present, which is not being assessed. And that lacking could be the fact that there might be fun and engagement, but, and I'm not talking about your experience, because your experience seemed to be deeper. But sometimes I think in the educational system and in classrooms that I've been in, you see that the child is having fun. You see that they're engaged. You see that they're doing the task. But then after they finish, they've forgotten.
I see.
You see? So I think there's that added bit of adding the fun and the engagement, but understanding that it has to be something also of value that the child is then going to be able to recall. What was that I did? Aside from at the moment, it seems to be that the data is showing us that the majority experiences that children have from school is when they go on trips, school trips, because very seldom they cherry pick, a particular topic. So I think that needs to be kind of looked at as well. Yeah.
So that is probably what I would call deep learning. So how do we get to a state of deep learning that also has the fun element to it so that it actually stays with you and it's not just this, oh, today was fun, we laughed so much. What did you learn? Oh, I don't know. So how do we get to the deep learning bit?
And I think that's where my principle of behaviors infrastructure comes into it, because behavior is not to be looked on as a policy or compliance issue or control. It's to be implemented and integrated into the infrastructure of the organization. So therefore, once we have that emotional literacy across the board and across teaching, leadership, all the levels that we have, we will then see that when we have our classrooms and when we have our teaching environments, or our learning environments, children will be having fun because they're directing their learning, because now they need to direct it because they have the tools to do that. So they're directing the learning. The adults are there to monitor the responsibility and accountability of that. However, do it in collaboration with the student, because now we are having students that are, age 10 years old, that are starting their own business online. Yeah, they're already doing an Airbnb and they're doing this and they're an influencer. And so they already know how to make a business. So if we just look at that progress of skills, then we need to understand that as educators, they are in charge of their life, of their learning. As long as we keep emotional literacy our priority, and it's not a soft skill, it's a strategy. And we need to do it and put it into place. And when we put it into place and we are committed that we are going to do it consistently, because the other thing we have in education in the UK is we tend to, in some organizations, we tend to change things very quickly. By quickly, I mean within a year or 2 years, and we change it when we haven't given that particular system enough time to work, to see, and we haven't placed relevant things in place. So to come back to your question, to achieve that is to know that behavior needs to be adopted as infrastructure.
You talked about AI and technology a little bit. I know you're very passionate about integrating it in ways that also helps actual learning. And not just makes it a fuzzy part of education just because everyone talks about it at the moment. So how do you do that? How do you make sure that that supports learning?
Think technology, right? We need to look at technology as not doing the thinking for us, but supporting human thinking, because technology can produce outputs, but it won't know when you need to have that human pause. And that is down to us. So therefore, when we are thinking about, when I say technology, I mean AI. Okay. So when we're thinking of what aspects of AI do I want to integrate into learning, it's not so much what, because that is fairly easy to determine. It is actually how am I going to do this? Then children need to ask, how am I going to use this? Not this is the way I'm going to use it, because that's fairly simple, because they'll have a goal and they'll be able to reach it. But we want them to encourage their ethical thinking. We want to encourage their discernment, their responsibility, because those are well-being skills as much as they are digital skills. So in order to do that, we need to educate our young people into asking, how am I going to do it? And then, which I feel is even more important, should I do it? Because we are so wrapped up with AI going so far and the internet going so far that we need to put controls in. We need to do this. But if we sit back and we look, it doesn't matter what controls we have to put further controls. So we're always going to be in an environment where AI is going to expand to such a degree where we are going to be chasing, what is the effective control. So instead of chasing the control, just step back and go to where our future is, which is our children. Give them the reasoning skills, that resilience and that way of questioning. How do I do it? And then is it responsible of me to do it? Then we're halfway there. That's my opinion.
I love that. In particular, the critical thinking bit about it, because that seems to be missing. Because that seems to be a tool for everything at the moment, and we just throw it in. But if you do that with children, then they will not be left with a second layer that needs to be added to this in the way of, right, is that the right thing to do now? Or should this more be of me thinking at first about this, doing a brainstorming, and then maybe adding a tool to that later? Because those are also the future-ready schools that we need, because they are supposed to produce the graduates that can then make a living in what is probably going to be an AI-dominated world. So how do we make that happen? What is the biggest shift in mindset that educators need to have or apply in order to make the schools future ready?
That's a brilliant question. I think the biggest shift should be moving from control to capacity with AI. So in that, I mean asking, can the system still function under particular amount of pressure? So can we still function? So with that, I mean that you need to have the system that protects the educator and the pupil as well when it is under pressure, not just when everything is okay, but when under pressure. So when we move into capacity, which is what we tend to think that is one aspect that is out of our control, is our capacity, because our capacity would depend on our recruitment efforts, which will depend on the economic climate at that moment, which, it just keeps on connecting to different things. However, when we look at it as capacity, we will then open creativity and risk-taking and curiosity. And that will open only, I don't mean to hop on it, but that will only actually get encouraged if everybody in that organization feels safe. So the minute you feel safe and the minute you feel that you are encouraged to make mistakes, because if you're not encouraged to make mistakes, you're not going to be creative. You're not going to come up with that idea because you're so, focused on not making a mistake. Oh, I have to be perfect. Oh, something might happen. So the minute you do that, you're allowing creativity, you're allowing new ideas to surface. Then we can cope with the opportunities, I like to say, because I feel that AI gives us opportunities because it's designed by humans. So we have the accountability, we have the responsibility, and we have the capability. So now we just have to define that we have the capacity to deal with it. And we have the capacity to use it to our advantage and the advantage of our future. And I would love it if we could understand that how important calm is, because we tend to make a lot of decisions when we are in fear and we are scared because we're listening to all these different things about AI. But if we know that we have the power of decision making, we have the power of discernment, we have the power of ethics, then we know that we can not control, but we can definitely harness or direct this power, because it will be dependent on us. There is that element to it, as much as we are hearing differently, but only if we put in these type of changes as behavior, as infrastructure. We put this change in and we are committed and we put it seriously. Because I feel that once parents and the wider community hear that we are delving into that and we are not leaving them behind, we're bringing them into it as well, right? We're going to do this together. It's okay if you don't know, it's fine. Neither did I. We learn together. Then that's it. Then we've built a larger community, and then the children as well will be more explorative and more curious. And then I think we'll breathe a sigh of relief because we'll feel like we have done our jobs for our children. We've done it. We are okay because we're giving them the skills for them to handle their future, because future is always uncertain. It's not just now. It is always an uncertain path. But at least we are doing it. We're giving them the best skills we can, which is their emotions.
It is a broad question. And just yesterday I saw a panel discussion involving Jonathan Haidt and two other individuals at the World Economic Forum. It also revolved around the issue of emotional resilience and the fact that today kids are usually less emotionally resilient because we don't teach them how to accept emotions, how to last through them, how to see that, yes, there will always be challenges, but I have the strength. I have that resilience to overcome, but not because an adult does it for me. It had more of the focus on parenting, but not because an adult does it for me, but because I have learned to do this myself. And one place to do that obviously will be schools too. So we talked a lot about psychological safety, the emotional range that children need to learn, how important it is for adults to be able to co-regulate, to understand ourselves, our triggers, our own emotions, in order to create this space for systemic and sustainable well-being. Now, if you were to come up with one thing that schools should focus on in the next decade in this whole context of well-being, what would that be for you?
I would say that when we focus on well-being, it's not about removing challenge. It's about creating the conditions where learners can approach that challenge with confidence and tackle it with rigor. And I think I'd also say that it would help if we didn't think of calm as a luxury or as an add-on, but if we thought of it as a baseline from where we will then operate. So we achieve that calmness no matter what the situation is. So I think that's what we need. We need to understand that that is the expectation. The more not unstable, but the more uncertain life becomes, or it's perceived to be, the more shaky the ground we feel we're standing on. Therefore, we need to know that we are steady. And in order to know we are steady, we need to know we are calm. And we need to know that our well-being is valued and our well-being is a strategy. It is not a soft thing. It's not added on, and it's not confused with being more kind. It's not anything to do with that. It's just allowing that challenge to be accessed intelligently with emotional intelligence. That's what I'd say. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We need more of that in this world. And it seems so easy if you look at that at first, but it is quite challenging to get there because then we'll also have to get a lot of the fast moving bits that we currently have in our worlds out and just center our focus. Think and reflect a little bit about what are the elements that we need in order to support children in their learning environments. And then also the future adults, and to make sure they develop those skills that they need in order to be future ready.
And you know what? I love what you said here about the adults, because this is what started me on Bridge and Bloom, was looking at my colleagues and lovely people I worked with, feeling that because of AI and the way the organizations were developing, they were feeling that they didn't have value. And my thing was to say that, no, you do. It just hasn't been shown how you can now change or show or demonstrate your value. So very much so, it's I think the biggest element here is focusing. I know we are interested in the child, it'll always be the child, but in order to get there, we need to focus on the adults, because the adults need to understand about their emotional intelligence. They need to understand how that affects other children and their children. There's a difference. They need to understand that. And I think that is where the focus needs to be. Absolutely.
Well, Sophie, thank you so much for your wonderful insights into well-being, also seen from a systemic, broader scale, and how schools can and should involve not only educators, but also parents in the conversation to make sure that we can achieve the best results for the children. Thank you for being on my podcast. Thank you for sharing a little bit about the work that you do in the UK.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that I managed to express my ideas clearly to your audience.
Thank you for listening to this episode. My guest on the March episode will be Carrie Sipp, a journalist, seasoned activist, and community builder. We will talk about the power of positive childhood experiences, in short, PCEs, in order to overcome adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. If this resonates with you, give it a listen.